This next segment follows from what we just talked about. We're going to talk about U.S. imperialism in particular. There was a time when you could bring up the idea of the United States as an imperial power and you could get an argument or a fight started. Nowadays, people tend to take it for granted that the United States is an imperial power. And what's especially troubling to an historian is that people think it's natural and inevitable that the United States is an imperial power. We don't question it anymore. You'll notice it's not a topic for conversation among presidential candidates. As we enter this election year, you will not hear our imperial policies come under question for the most part. At any rate, there's a long-standing debate among historians as to when the United States or when the American people became imperialistic. Some historians go all the way back to the English colonies at Plymouth and at Jamestown and the desire to expand westward, pushing the Indians out of the way. Other historians will point to the war with Mexico in the 1840s, when the United States became a truly continental country from the Atlantic to the Pacific, pushing both the Mexicans and the Indians and others out of the way as we sort of fulfill our manifest destiny to dominate this continent. Probably most historians would point to 1898 and the Spanish-American War as the time when the United States truly became a world power. So we want to look at a few significant ideas in the development of the U.S. as an imperial or world power. I want to bring to your attention a book, a terribly influential book, written by Alfred Mahan. He's a retired U.S. naval officer. Alfred Mahan wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in this book, he made an argument. He said that the United States, or the American people, had traditionally treated the Atlantic and the Pacific as protective barriers. He said the time for this was over. We should not look at the great oceans as protective barriers. We should look at them as avenues of opportunity. He said if the United States is going to become a great power, then we have to use these oceans to access both Asia and Europe. Mahan made the argument that we're going to need not only a great merchant marine, but we're going to need a battleship navy to protect our interests if we're going to venture out into the Atlantic and Pacific. He went on to make the point that not only are we going to need a navy, but we're going to need coaling stations and ports of call and places for our sailors to have R&R and on and on. And he pointed out that the best natural harbor in the Central Pacific was at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and that this should be a post that the United States should acquire. He also made the argument that the United States would need a Pacific and an Atlantic fleet, but that it was prohibitively expensive and time-consuming for these fleets to have to travel all the way around the tip of South America, Cape Horn, in order to access the other ocean. He said that we should acquire the most narrow point in the Western Hemisphere, and once we acquire it, we should dig a ditch through it so we could have quick access from the Atlantic to the Pacific, both for the merchant marine and for the Navy. Now, these ideas will be put into force after 1900 by President Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt read this book and took its message to heart. Now, you can see some of the cartoons or some of the editorial political cartoons I've included here. You can see Teddy exercising this imperial power here. You see Teddy wading through the Caribbean as if it were a backyard pool. And of course he has his big stick. What was the slogan? Speak softly and carry a big stick. And you can see U.S. naval forces accompanying him. This, of course, points to what has gone down in history as gunboat diplomacy. It's much easier to get your negotiating partner to make concessions if you can threaten him with military force. We see another cartoon here of Teddy Roosevelt, and you can see his big stick being put into action, sort of the policeman of the Caribbean and the New World, or the Western Hemisphere at this point. Now, not only does Teddy put these ideas into action, these policies promoted by Mahan, but he's able to do it during what's called the splendid little war, the Spanish-American War. Cuba, of course, had been part of the Spanish Empire since Columbus. By the early 20th century, the Spanish Empire in the West had become decrepit, increasingly weakened and diminished. The Cuban people wanted independence from Spain. The United States sided with the Cuban people, and we helped the Cubans acquire their independence from Spain in the Spanish-American War. Of course, the Cubans, whether they knew it or not, they simply exchanged one master, the Spanish, for another, the Americans. And the Americans, like I said earlier, established what was essentially a protectorate in Cuba. The United States acquired other territories as a result of the Spanish-American War. The Philippines, other territories in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Here is where the United States sort of leaves the continental borders of North America and moves across the ocean to begin to acquire colonies in the traditional imperial manner. A couple of key ideas here. One is China. China has an enduring allure for the American businessman and politician. Let's face it, China has the largest population of any country, and the thought of acquiring the China market is something that has stuck in the imagination of American imperialists. Let's face it, it doesn't matter what you sell to the Chinese. If you can sell 2 billion of them, you're going to make a nice profit if it's toothpicks or tractors. So the China market is an enduring temptation, still alive today. The Spanish-American War allows us to sort of hop, skip, and jump across the Pacific to Hawaii and to Guam, the Philippines, and finally to China. The U.S. open door is a policy designed to gain access to the China market without establishing colonies. This is sort of a soft empire in the terms of today. The United States has, through its imperial policy, has extended what Jefferson once called the empire of liberty. And this is how the American people have often viewed U.S. expansion, as not a predatory action, but an action of goodwill, an action of generosity or benevolence, whereby the United States is spreading not only Christianity, but is spreading the market economy, expanding new technologies to places that otherwise would not have them, and to expand Republican-style governments to places that are more used to despots and tyrants. So this soft empire of the United States in the Pacific is not viewed pejoratively by most of the American people. Now, there are some politicians and some intellectuals in the United States who will protest this expansion of our power beyond our borders and say that we began as a republic and we should remain a republic, and then in fact a republic cannot coincide with an empire. Again, these objections have been brushed aside essentially. As you can see today, the United States has military bases in dozens and dozens of countries. It would be easier to talk about the countries we don't have bases in as opposed to those that we do. So the United States has a worldwide reach today. This reach begins really with the Spanish-American War. Now, I'll say one more thing about this Spanish-American conflict, this splendid little war, as John Hay called it. The The event that provoked war between Spain and the United States in 1898 was the explosion of the USS Maine, a battleship stationed in Havana Harbor in Cuba. The Maine exploded and killed more than 200 United States Marines and sailors. This was the ostensible cause of the war. Now, the Maine was later brought to the surface. There was an investigation, and it was discovered that apparently the boiler in the engine room exploded. And this was the cause of the disaster. Now, this is something else that you as students will probably remember. We were given reasons for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, were we not? Your government told you every day that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And this was the cause of our invasion of Iraq. There was the notion that Saddam Hussein might give these weapons to terrorists who could then use them against us. We'll get into this later in the semester, but remember that we supplied Saddam Hussein with most of these weapons in the late 70s, early 80s, and so that he could use them to attack Iran. So we knew what Saddam Hussein possessed. Yet the American people quite easily believed this argument based on weapons of mass destruction. Well, here you see the similar tactics used with the USS battleship Maine in 1898 as a cause of the Spanish-American War. You get the sense that the Spanish-American War would have come about one way or the other. If it had not been the Maine, it would have been another incident to inflame American opinion. I want to refer you again to the editorial cartoons and to the maps which demonstrate U.S. imperialism, not only in the Caribbean, but across the Pacific. And you can see some of the products and some of the reasons for our expansion. Those things that are desired by U.S. industry, cheap labor, cheap natural resources, access to strategic waterways. When we get back, our next lecture, we will move from imperialism to the Great War, the First World War that begins in 1914. And as you'll recall, in Lenin's justification of imperialism, he made the argument that the great powers would go to war as they compete for scarce natural resources and cheap labor and markets. I don't think imperialism is the main cause by any means of the Great War, but it is a contributing factor. And we'll also do a short review next time before we get into the big topic of the First World War. Thank you.